I think one thing that is it's not, left out necessarily in kind of scholarly discussions and things, but maybe on the popular level is just what comes after.
Yes.
There's, you know, again, for Paul, multiple Old Testament citations, right? So after he says, and in this way all Israel will be saved in verses 26 and 27, he cites kind of a combo, right, of Isaiah 59, 27. I think Jeremiah 31, Psalm 14. I mean, you could pull multiple Psalms probably here. But really the question is, in your view, do you think we should take these references as referring to Christ's first or second coming? In which do you find more compelling? And then I guess, how important are they for helping us understand this passage as a whole?
All right, great question. And I would say it's partly the wrong question. And what I mean by that is that's usually how most people frame it. So you did a good job representing how people are going to ask the question. Hey, because everyone's like, was this first coming or second coming?
Yeah.
And I think that's not really what Paul's trying to address. I think it is relevant. It's not irrelevant, but it's not primarily what's happening. So let me say a couple things. So he's now seeking to ground, as he often does, his statement in the Old Testament. But again, it's a mystery. It's something that hasn't been revealed. So we can't simply just quote a passage. Well, there it is. See, because that would miss the point of what a mystery is. But what Paul does here is he does a couple things. We know that Paul is, well, maybe a little context here. When Paul quotes the Old Testament, he doesn't simply quote it the way we might. Like if you're preaching the Bible, like you read some verses and you
Yeah.
explain it. You read some verses and you explain it. That's not exactly what Paul does. Paul, as an apostle, is actually not simply reading the Old Testament and explaining it. He's actually, I would argue, kind of baking his interpretation into the quotation. So the quotation he gives us is already a theological distillation of his hermeneutic. He's actually interpreting already in the quotation. And we know that's true from the simple reality that it's a compound quotation, even just
Yeah.
that reality
Yep.
alone. What I mean by that is he doesn't simply just quote from one passage. He actually quotes, I would argue, so that's you raised a question about what's actually quoted here. That's important because what passages people see quoted here, I think influences how they read the quotation and the relevance it has for Paul.
Yeah, totally.
Okay. Now, and let me simply say, you don't someone doesn't have to agree with how I'm reading the quotation here to necessarily agree with the future mass conversion view. Okay. What most people think is happening here is it's just simply buttressing the last phrase, right? And thus all Israel will be saved. And look, the Old Testament says the deliverer will come from Zion to save Jews, to save Israel. So they just take the quotation as simply a grounding for the last part of that three-part mystery statement. But I think that misses the point because the mystery statement is not simply that all Israel will be saved. It's this reversal of the sequence of salvation. Okay. So the main quote comes from Isaiah 59, verses the end of the chapter there, verses 20 and 21. The deliverer will come from Zion. He will banish ungodliness from Jacob, and this will be my covenant. So the quotation has 4 lines. The first 3 lines come from Isaiah 59, verses 20 and the first half of 21. And then Paul cuts off the middle of the verse, middle 21, and he pulls out another phrase, when I take away their sins. Some people see an allusion here or even a quotation to Jeremiah 31, and I think they're drawn to that in the Septuagint, it's chapter 38. I think they're drawn to that because he just got done referring to my covenant, which I do think in context he's referring to the new covenant. And the only place in the Old Testament that phrase new covenant is used is Jeremiah
Yeah.
31. And Jeremiah 31 does talk about, forgiveness of sins. But a couple things. I don't think he's directly quoting Jeremiah 31. I think you could say it's an allusion or it's a reference. That's fine. But it's quoting, I think he's actually quoting from Isaiah 27, verse 9, because the specific verb he uses is only found here. And the same 5 words are only found in Isaiah 27, 9. And it's interesting, knowing that we were going to talk about this, I just pulled out my new copy of Connecting Scripture New Testament,
Yeah.
see how they
Yeah.
do it? And they do reference that it's in the text, they put in blue the Isaiah 59, Isaiah 27, and Jeremiah 31. So they
Yeah.
see it. But interestingly enough, I think there's maybe a discrepancy between the editors who did the coloring and the
That's fair.
contributor who did the notes, because the notes only mention it's from 2 passages, not 3. So they don't reference Jeremiah 31, but
Yeah.
the appendix at the end does. So for what it's worth. Okay. But so first of all, why does he cut off, the end of why does he pick Isaiah 59? Why does he pick Isaiah 27? Why does he stitch these two passages together? And so that's one question. Another question is, why does he change the wording of the first line? I think that's actually really significant too. So when Paul says the deliverer will come from Zion, that's ek Zion, right? From Zion, out of Zion. Well, the Masoretic text is a lamed. It's a to Zion. The Septuagint doesn't have ek Zion. Usually you can say, well, maybe Paul's just quoting the Septuagint. No, it's actually for the sake of Zion, anekin Zion. So the Septuagint can be explained as coming from the Masoretic text if you take the Masoretic text, the lamed, as a lamed of like respect as opposed to a spatial lamed,
Yeah.
right? And not instead of like to locationally, but on behalf of the people, maybe. But Paul doesn't follow either one. So there's been a lot of theories over, well, then where does this language of out of Zion come from? That's where some try to find some Old Testament grounding for it, and that's where the appeal to Psalm 14:7 is, or in the Septuagint is chapter 13. And the reason is because, in that context, we have it talks about God saving Israel. He's coming from Zion, ex Zion, and even the next line talks about Jacob. So they find some parallel wording, but I don't think that's helpful because Psalm 14 in English, in Hebrew, is simply talking about, again, God's going to come to save Israel. And my point is simply this. Let me say this. Okay, so why these passages? What is Paul trying to ground, and why does he change the wording? Okay, so there's a lot of argumentation undergirding this, but
Yeah.
some say, well, he changed from, instead of saying the Redeemer will come to Zion, he's going to come from Zion, but he's still going to come to Israel because now Israel is in spiritual exile. So he's got to go from Zion out to the Gentile world where the Jews are in a diaspora context. So he's going out to the Gentile lands, but still for the sake of Israel. And this is where they're appealing to Israel's in spiritual exile, so it's a heavenly Zion. And this is where they'll say, well, Zion here refers to heavenly Zion, so that's how Paul uses it in Galatians 4:26, or we see the same tradition represented in Hebrews 12. And that view is going to locate it in the second coming. But going back to your question about first, second coming.
Yeah.
So and that's a very common explanation. Other people will say no, because that's not really, that's still, even though it's still basically representing the Septuagintal view it's still for the sake of Israel, Zion, but it's in Gentile lands.
Mm-hmm.
All right. Another line of argumentation from other scholars say no. The reason Paul changes the wording from Zion is not because he's going to Jews in Gentile lands, but he's actually going from Zion to the Gentiles. And so the ek Zion we find in another passage in Isaiah, and they say there's actually 3 quotes in this compound quote, Isaiah 2:3. And so they're saying the reason that God is going to the Gentiles from Zion is because Isaiah 59 has already been fulfilled in the first coming. So it's still maintaining God went to Israel first. Now he's going to the Gentiles. The Redeemer's already come to Zion, Hebrew text. So now he's going out from Zion to the nations. So Paul has to update the text, change the wording of the quotation by merging these quotations together to represent his place in salvation history. Because he's trying to argue that Isaiah 59 has already been fulfilled in the first coming. Now it's to the future. You find that, N.T. Wright in his newer work argues this view. Chris Bruno argues this view.
Mm-hmm.
Others argue this view. And so they're finding the quotation being a reference to the first coming of Christ.
Mm-hmm.
I think both of those views, it's either one or the other. I think they're both not quite right. I would say instead of either or, either it's like it's either for Israel and Gentile lands, or it's for the Gentiles and only talking about the Gentile salvation because Israel's already been saved. I actually think it's both and. It's actually both and. I think what Paul does here in this quotation is, and again, spend a lot more time on this. We're probably taking too long already, but
Sure.
is that he is in this quotation. The quotation from the Old Testament is supporting the whole mystery statement, not just part of the mystery statement. It's the whole mystery statement. And he wants to argue that the deliverer, Christ, will come from Zion, not heavenly Zion, because the only other time Zion's used in the only reference in Isaiah is to physical Zion, and only reference in these verses, in these chapters, chapter 9, verse 33, is to, physical Zion. So I don't think he's talking about heavenly Zion here. I think he's talking about, like, he's speaking spatially and in terms of the people. The deliverer will come out of Zion to the Gentiles. I think they're right. Bruno and Wright, that argue that view, are correct. Not on behalf of Israel, but he's going to the Gentiles. But then the clearest reference that Jews and Gentiles are both in view in this quotation is the next line. He will banish ungodliness from Jacob. So in going and bringing salvation to the Gentiles, it's actually how he's going to remove the sin problem for Israel and allow them to come in and therefore partake of the covenant. This will be my covenant with them when I take away their sins. So I think he has in mind the same thing he just argued in the mystery statement is what I'm trying to say. I think he has in mind that there's a hardening that's come upon Israel, right, because of their sin. So they need
Yeah.
the sin removed until the fullness of the Gentiles has come in, which is the fullness of the Gentiles are coming in because the Redeemer is going out from Zion to the Gentiles. And thus all Israel will be saved, and this will be my covenant with them when I take away their sins. So I think he's referring to the salvation that God brings to Jews and Gentiles together, which, when we see with these eyes, we even see in the Old Testament. So even in Isaiah 2, which is a classic passage that they're appealing to, is like, well, that's to Israel being saved, and now it's going to the Gentiles. Actually, when you read Isaiah 2 and you keep reading verses 5 and 6, he's actually bidding the Jews to come and follow in the train that the Gentiles have, because Israel has a sin and hardening that needs to be overcome. And it actually happens by means of the Gentile salvation. So I think what Paul's trying to say, it's actually in the Old Testament. It just wasn't clearly revealed. And I'm going to put the pieces together for you by interpretively modifying this quotation to represent my place in redemptive history. So God is going to save all Israel after Israel's hardened, after the gospel comes to the Gentiles, and then it comes to all of them. And the reason he picked Isaiah 59 as the anchor text, because Isaiah 59 isn't just about God saving Jews, because it's a pivotal passage, because right after these verses, he goes into a lengthy discussion about how the gospel is going to the nations. He picked these passages because these are pivotal passages in Isaiah that actually talk about God saving Israel, and then as a consequence, saving Gentiles. And Paul's saying, yes, that's true, but the way he's doing it is by hardening them first, then the Gentiles, then the Jews. And so that sequence of salvation is what is the mystery that Paul has to piece together several passages from Isaiah to make the point in context to support the whole mystery statement.